Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session. We can start, this evening's session, a journey into the brain in search of consciousness. Well, every year, several scientific articles and books tell us about the incredible level of success of neurosciences. As a matter of fact, over the last years, neuroscience made huge progress. For instance, today we have pretty clear ideas about the way complicated neural circuits work. They are able, for instance, to coordinate complex movements and the motion of objects, so specific prostheses directly controlled by the brain have been designed. You have this special neural brain interface that has been developed. But in spite of this progress, we still don't know exactly how to answer to one of the most fundamental questions, that is the following. How can matter host a subject? And in particular, is there a secret about consciousness? Is there any at all? So this is a fascinating, somehow worrying and intriguing question, because it has to do maybe with the secret of the eye. But let's try to identify now with a young student of medicine, here interpreted by Matteo Bonanni. Imagine to have in your hands a brain, a human brain. Well, medicine students have this opportunity when they see an autopsy. The first one I saw was a marking experience. It's a brutal revelation. We're made of a very little elegant matter that is not easy to get. Well, that jelly matter that you keep in your hand used to hold a few hours earlier a whole universe. Everything you dream, imagine, think, and dream is included in this piece of matter that has a weight. And that, wow, gives vertigo. It's incredible. So if you weigh a human brain in the hand, it's something that changes you forever. It's a disruptive gesture. What is so special in such a piece of matter? So we may think about the beauty and perfection, and how can we connect this to this little oily machine that sooner or later will just stop working? But we are not just that. We are much more than that. And then we come across the void gaze of the corpse, and we can do nothing but think about the special individual that was a human being. And we have just touched what made the difference in a conscious man. If you want to give a meaning to all that, we need to understand what the brain is about, to understand it deeply. For an instant, during the autopsy, we had the impression that that physical object had something special, something unique. We need to understand what is this special element the brain contains.
Ecco, questa esperienza
These are the questions that resulted in the research work of Marcello Massimini, physiology professor at the Biomedical Science Department of the University of Milan. And Marcello is one of the most important experts when it comes to consciousness and its specific biological and neural features. He published several articles in a very important international journals, and together with Giulio Tononi is the author of a book entitled Nulla di più grande, nothing bigger, and the extract that was uttered by the actor in the video was taken from this book. Thank you very much, Marcello, for joining us, and thank you for guiding us in this journey that aims at looking for traces of the consciousness. Thank you very much. I would like to thank especially Tommaso Bellini, who is a friend and a colleague. We had a nice chat, and he proposed me to join this talk. So I start with the first question out of the three that we have prepared for you. The first one is the following. Normally, we tend to associate consciousness with the ability of a subject to solve more or less complicated problems through voluntary actions. Is this association correct? Is this match correct? Or can we have consciousness even in cases where we do not observe so-called intelligent behaviors? My quick answer is no. And, well, I must be frank, we had a couple of chats before this meeting, so I prepared a couple of slides to explain why no. So if we identify the consciousness with the intelligent behavior, we risk to see consciousness where there is and the other way around. For instance, if I have to judge my own consciousness, well, of course, now I know that I'm conscious. I'm here with my computer in front of me, and I imagine you beyond the other side of the screen. And the very same fact of asking myself this question shows and proves that I'm aware, I'm conscious. And Descartes used to say, so I think, therefore I am. So in a few hours, I will sleep, and the whole universe, let's say, will disappear, because so sleeping is a bit like dying. And maybe my consciousness will somehow disconnect during sleep, but then tomorrow morning it will come back as vivid and as bright as usual. So the universe also will come back to me. So each one of us can define consciousness. So consciousness can be defined by everything that disappears when we fall asleep. But this is a sort of pre-scientific definition. It's like saying that mass is something heavy instead of defining it through the Newtonian physics with units and measurements, because we have no objective measurement of consciousness. So we find difficulties in defining the consciousness of somebody else, of the other. And so here problems begin. Let's see why. So there is no direct unit of measurement of consciousness, and considering that we have no access to the consciousness of the others, but just to ours, when we have to decide whether another person is conscious or not, we try to reason by analogy. So if the other person more or less behaves like us, it means that it is conscious. So more or less willingly we have adopted this paradigm. This is a typical behavioralist, functionalist paradigm. So we explore the other's consciousness by analyzing their response to stimuli. And so according to their behavior, the complexity of their responses. We do that every day in our daily life. We do that also when we adopt this direct relation between observable smart behavior. We do that in clinics, in hospitals, in resuscitation departments, in emergency rooms. So we assess the response of the patient according to specific scales. So we do that also on a natural scale. For instance, we are naturally inclined to attribute more consciousness to a dog that responds to commands, to requests, and shows emotional responses that are similar to ours. Well, it's more difficult for a jellyfish. And so somehow, if we measure the intelligence of an octopus, so we have more problems. But still, it is a pretty smart animal. It is able also to play. But we are changing nature. This is the most important thing. We are somehow, first of all, seeing that intensive care units are saving brains that would have not existed up until 50 years ago. But then when there are very severe motor and sensory deficits, well, these brains are like isolated. So sometimes they are almost to zero as far as intelligent behavior is concerned, but there is still some consciousness. And then we are also creating, on the other hand, artificial systems that have incredible functions and performances. This is the IBM Watson computer that has been able to beat anybody else at Jeopardy, a quiz game. Now we have deep learning networks. These are neural networks that can self-learn, and they can do incredible things, really. They can animate our vocal assistants and smartphones, recognize images. AlphaGo, a deep learning sophisticated network, did something extraordinary recently. It was able to beat at a millenary game that is called Go, to beat the champions. And these champions were really worshipped for their intelligence, balance, and creativity at the same time. Typical human features that are typical of human creativity. Still, these machines that are so high-performing were able to overachieve the performances of a sound man, and probably they are at zero on the y-axis. So that is why we risk to see consciousness where there is none in disconnected patients, and we risk on the other, we risk not to see it where there is one, like in disconnected patients, and the other way around. For instance, in these artificial forms of intelligence. That's why it's hard to define consciousness. So in other words, we need to think about the fact that until a more well-defined unit of measurement will be found, well, we will always have problems in defining what consciousness is. Thank you, Marcello, for this first answer. With respect to this, which are the implications of this distinction between consciousness and smart behavior, intelligent behavior, if we consider patients that do not show or show very weak functional abilities? So what can science do in these cases? Can science be useful somehow in these cases? So this is certainly the most urgent question. And this is also what I deal with, so I'll try to be short. So as I said before, we do not exactly know which are the consciousness mechanisms in the brain. So the brain is like a black box. So we use this input-output model to assess the level of consciousness of a patient. So when a patient responds in a specific and repeatable way, so there's no problem. But the problem exists when there is no response, because in that case, the absence of the proof is not a proof of the absence. There are patients that can understand all. They would like to respond, but they can't, maybe because they have a palsy, an almost complete palsy or a partial palsy. For instance, you have the locked-in syndrome. You see a lesion here in a strategic point that blocks and locks all the fibers that go from the brain cortex to the muscles. So these are dramatic cases, and in the past, there were patients that were not acknowledged as conscious for even months, but very often they have the third brain nerve that can be a communication channel, so they can use eye movements as a communication way. And so sometimes there is a nurse or a dear one that says, if you're hearing me, please blink. And so they understand that the patient understands, and so some communication channels can be established. Beautiful books about this have been written, like the book by Jean-Dominique Bobby. And then we have the sensory cortexes that may be blocked. Some locked-in patients, are somehow really blocked, but sometimes even the sensory channel can be blocked. So you have here a patient with a lesion on the left hemisphere, and so there is a very serious sensory block, and there is no stimulus that can get to it. So there are many combinations. So de facto, with intensive care units and ventilation, and unfortunately, ventilation is very well known today. It's been key for many patients. And so, after a coma, ventilation supports a patient, and so sometimes brains that would have not survived still survive, and sometimes they're like islands, so they are integral and active, but totally disconnected from the outside world. Together with Bain and Sat, we have analyzed the problem of disconnected consciousness from a philosophical point of view. But again, there are many, many patients in this condition that equal the size of a U.S. city. And we have from 30 to 40% of patients that are conscious and that are acknowledged as such. So from a mere vantage point of observation, these conscious patients are very hard to define. Sometimes they can have an hemisphere lesion of some brain parts that are disconnected. What we know is that consciousness can exist also in a disconnected brain. We all dream, and during dreams, consciousness still exists, even if you are disconnected from the outside world. And so we still adopt input-output model. So the real challenge is to develop measurement ways that are more physical-oriented and objective, based on the internal status of the brain, and that are independent from input-output models. This is a challenge. We made a little progress, but not enough yet. And frankly, we need to do more. Recently, there has been a review of the literature in the field. Marcello, sorry for cutting you. Can you just speak a bit more slowly, because there is a little bit of echo? Can you speak more slowly, because there is an echo effect? Okay, no problem. So when it comes to this challenge of measuring and understanding the consciousness in the brain, is not easy. Neuroscientists are working hard on that, we have some measures that work. Some work more, others less, but they are not accurate enough yet to let us really define in a pretty objective way the level of consciousness in the patients. I could make many examples. I'll make a couple. For instance, it was natural and spontaneous to think that consciousness have to do with cerebral activity. So an active brain is conscious. A little active brain or almost a switched off brain is unconscious. Here you see the metabolic activity of a conscious brain on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the reduced metabolic activity of a brain in a vegetative state. But still, patients that recover consciousness after brain lesion do not necessarily increase their metabolism. So again, metabolism can be something, but it's not enough. And we have epilepsy, for instance. Epilepsy is a condition where consciousness is lost, but look at what happens. Here we have a reading of cerebral metabolism at 0 time. You have an absence of epilepsy, and so you have a hyperactivity. So when there is a recovery, you see in blue the little of activity. So when there is absence of seizure. So it's very hard to squeeze somehow consciousness out of brain activity, but we should not lose hope. A possible strategy that we are following is slightly different. So we start from a theoretical assumption. The theory is called integrated information theory. It's very interesting, and the most interesting element of this theory is that it carries out an epistemological revolution. The theory says, do not try to extract and separate consciousness from the physics of the brain, because it's not correct. From Galileo on, we have somehow extracted subjectivity because we think about scientific investigation. But when we think about consciousness, we think about subjectivity. So the theory says the best matter to start from, the best datum is how our experience is made. Let's try to analyze that. Let's try to see which are the features, because we know that very well. And then let's try to infer from that. Let's try to look for those features in the physical world. This is what we usually do ethically as physicians vis-a-vis the surrounding world. So this is a real revolution. We start from the consciousness and we move towards physics, as the title of this article says. What is the general idea behind this? The rationale had already been proposed some 20 years ago by Giulio Tononi and Edelman. Very interesting article that says, well, if each one of us makes some insights and tries to see which are the 2 key features of consciousness, well, then that person realizes that there are a couple of things. Conscious experience is highly informative and also quite uniform. So when we look for that around in the physical world, it's not about the neural activity, number of neurons. It's this balance between, diversity and neural activity, diversity and unity, what we can sort of call complexity. What is the informative level of consciousness? It means that even if when we are in the dark or in front of a dark screen, in pure silence, this is still an informative situation, because in that specific moment in time, we are in the darkness, but the brain had access to a great variety of alternatives. This is pure information. It means that the brain inside has such a diversified set of realities that could choose among many. And exactly, unity is this. Well, you cannot sort of have 2 parallel and simultaneous conscious states at the same time. Either you see a vase, either you see two profiles, but not the two things at the same time. There's always a millisecond sort of delay. So the theory says this balance between diversity and unity is the thing that we need to look for. And then we need to develop tools to investigate this kind of complexity in the brain. This is our goal. Metaphorically, we are in this kind of situation. We try to see if the orchestra in the brain that is made of neurons and the cerebral areas is made by diversified elements like instruments that can interact as a whole and produce the complex symphony of consciousness. What we do with the orchestra is simply to sort of start the music and see if the music is a complex symphony or not. So to see if there is unity and diversity. So we need to do that in the brain. So we need to directly stimulate the orchestra, and the brain cortex is the most important part, regardless of the input and output. So the sensory and motor inputs and outputs, and we need to see if the interactions among the different elements are unitary, global, and rich, as it is somehow expected, theoretically speaking, and see how these analysis guides us through the behaviors. So how can we do that? One way would be to directly stimulate the brain with a transcranial magnetic stimulator, and then assess the electric music produced by the brain with the EEG. So theory says that if you see an electric response that is localized and remains localized only where you have stimulated, so there is no unity, so there is no integration, there is no consciousness. If the response is global but is not differentiated and is not rich, that means that yes, there is unity, but there is no diversity. So one of the three ingredients is missing. Instead, if the response is global but diversified with different responses, different areas, with different timings, you have the sort of required level of, integration and differentiation and the complexity. So the idea is to measure the balance between integration, differentiation, unity, and diversity in the brain. So here you see an example, just to be more, let's say, concrete. This is the setup. A typical setup that we use to stimulate the brain. This is a stimulator, the one I was mentioning, the TMS. It has been positioned in a specific target cortex area. You see the Euro navigation system, then we record the response to the electric music generated by the rest of the brain, and we do that by these electrodes sort of put on the head, on the scalp. So we directly knock on the cerebral cortex, bypassing the sensory and motor inputs, and we directly measure the complexity inside the brain. And this kind of measure, for instance, in awake times, so shows these electrical response. You see that there are many electrodes that are activated, so this is when the brain is awake. So somehow we see that there is unity because all elements interacted, but there is also diversity. So the pattern is there. Because if you reconstruct the spatial temporal dynamics in a subject that is awake, you see these interactions that go around, and they're pretty complex and different. So you see the different parts get activated for even quite long time, 300 milliseconds. Each part activates by itself in different ways. So this is an echo of that complexity. This is a pretty sort of row measurement, but it's clear. When the subject falls asleep, the answer gets simpler. And if you allow me to say, you see that the response is different because we stimulate the very same area, but the neural activity is different. So there is no more unity, there is no more integration, and this is a clear example of recording made during the sleep without dreams. Again, that's it. If we stimulate a bit harder, a bit stronger, what happens? If we use a stronger magnetic stimulus, well, we get a gigantic response where, I mean, everybody does the same, so diversity is not there. So from a physical point of view, we have these axioms. So in consciousness integrated and differentiated, but then when you measure, you have a level of prediction. So you predict that you can lose this complexity in the physical world, you lose differentiation and unity, and then we made several sort of double checks to test this approach. Well, for instance, we analyzed the wakefulness also in patients with brain lesions, and then we analyzed disconnected consciousness states, the REM sleep that has a high level of complexity, for instance. But then we also analyzed the ketamine. It's an anesthetic substance. So if the subject is responseless, is totally disconnected from the outside, it can undergo surgery, but still remains conscious. So it is like somewhere else. It's in a sort of hallucinogenic state, so in a deep onirical state, and it's still somehow conscious. But with these doses of ketamine, the patient looks like vegetative. The coma scale would say that he's vegetative. But still, this is the counter sort of check when there is no REM sleep or another kind of anesthetic that has a different mechanism than ketamine. If you, for instance, use midazolam or xenon, you have another kind of response. So the complexity is lost and consciousness is lost. Every time complexity comes back, even if these subjects are disconnected, consciousness comes back as well. So that encouraged us because this validation tells us that in well-known conditions we can infer from the unknown situation. So when we wanted to measure the consciousness outside, well, we didn't have much to do. So we moved to the beds of non-responsive patients. Here, the behavior does not tell us anything. Well, here things would be quite long because we devoted a lot of time to develop quantitative measure and to validate that. So I want to show you what we can say about this approach and this measure in non-responsive patients, so those that we call vegetative patients. So I'll give an example.
These are patients that we have studied, many patients indeed, also at the Fondazione Dognocchi. Here you have patient 1 and patient 2, they're both non-responsive, and from the point of view of an external observer, they look identical. Then we open the black box with our stimulation, and we explore the status of the physical system underneath, and we see that the patient on the left shows a high complexity response, and on the right side, the response is not complex. So what do we do when we find a high complexity patient, even if he or she is not responsive? On the basis of theory and the measure that we developed, and considering that complexity is also present in disconnected patients and so on, we should infer that this patient is conscious. And if they don't communicate, if they keep being non-responsive, we have to do as much as possible to establish a communication channel. I'll give an example of a patient that we have studied recently, one of many, that had a lesion in an area of the brain. I'm not going to go into details, but it's a black substance there that promotes executive functions, black matter there. This patient was not responsive, has a lesion in the dark matter, and still shows highly complex response. So let's try to give a particular drug to stimulate that. So we used, on the basis of the measures and the rationale, a drug that can stimulate motor responses. And after a week, these patients are studied by Angela Comanducci, who's a very good neurologist at the Don Gnocchi Institute. And this is what happened. This is even moving, I'd say. After months, this patient could respond to the stimuli.
E così via.
This is not the only case. This approach allows us to go deeper and to see consciousness even beyond function and behavior. And this has practical implications, of course. It is an open question what to do with patients with low complexity. That's what I and my colleagues in Milan at the Don Gnocchi focus on. We spend a lot of energy in that. It is how to give back complexity to those brains that have lost it. But this is another story, and there's no time now to focus on this in this presentation. But I hope that you could appreciate this example of objective measures that derive from consciousness. So we consider consciousness really into account seriously as a primary fact, and then we develop postulates to break through with the physical world, and we think that this can be useful today. Thank you very much for showing new methods to face the study of consciousness. And you're studying consciousness in the sense of perceiving the presence of the subject in a way that requires new frameworks, new concepts that you are developing. It is easy to think that in the near future, new horizons may open up, unexplored horizons may open up that will be complex, just like the way you are doing. So how do you see, what do you think the biggest scientific and cultural challenges might be in our next future? Well, this is a very important question indeed. Well, in the short term, I would say that the fundamental issue is that we should understand what happens with the patient on the right, with these brains that are not responsive and low complex. What happens is that some areas have a lesion, but the surrounding areas, and in case of vegetative patients, all the brain may fall in a state of low complexity, such as sleep. We know that it is reversible, where sleep is reversible, and this mechanism that is similar to sleep, and there is an imbalance in the neurons, but it could be counterbalanced in a way. So that would mean that it would be possible to restore consciousness in some patients. In some patients, this happens spontaneously. The sleep-like activity then transforms itself into a more complex activity. For other patients, we don't really know what to do. Studying neuron mechanisms is definitely important for the future. There might be few, but if we can restore consciousness in brains that seem to have lost it, this is a very important thing, as well as regenerating patients in serious conditions. So one of the urgent challenges is to improve our measurements, our understanding of the mechanisms, and to understand these brain islets that is a collateral effect of medicine, because many patients recover, that survive and restore their consciousness, but others continue to be in that state. And so we have to understand as scientists what happens in those brains and what can be done to help them. And this will require a lot of technological development. Then medicine will also pose further challenges, different challenges. One is this. This is an article that should be considered with care. It was published in Nature a couple of years ago. The technology now is available to keep brains alive, even post-mortem, even outside the skull. This has been done with swine brain, which is different. So if medicine decided to follow this way to extract brains outside bodies, that would raise important questions, important problems. It wouldn't be possible to support circulation. That would be an enormous problem. We don't know whether medicine will tell us to do that or not. In that case, we would have temporarily disconnected the brains that are not accessible anymore. So we have to be careful. This is an example among many, but it's something that we should consider. Then there is the problem of consciousness outside the man. I mentioned octopuses before. Oh, the octopus is almost an alien on Earth. It's got 3 hearts, a brain that has nothing to do with ours, 8 arms. Well, many people know about this special animal and is able to do everything. There are now many books that are being published about the life of octopuses, and they talk about the soul of the octopus. So is this a complex brain, or is it just a neural network that can function in a way but is not hosting any consciousness? These are all open questions. And then, as you also mentioned, there is a deeper problem, that is the cultural problem, and we might consider this with more detail now. It is an issue of educating a new sensitivity towards consciousness. I've seen this in my children already that were playing with Siri. When they were little, they would ask any question. Is this the girl friend of somebody else? And then Julia wasn't even able to speak 1.5 years, and they were a little bit lost because they said, why can't she speak, and why can Siri speak? Well, I had to explain that one was a machine and the other there was a person, a conscious person that was still developing her speech abilities. But for future generations will be native of artificial intelligence. And this is a bit of a rough example. This is Sophia. This is a humanoid robot. For some reason, she got the Saudi citizenship and can respond to questions in a clever way, in a funny way. And this is a reality of today. We don't have the possibility to listen to the audio file. Maybe you can describe what was going on. Yes, it was a robot that was speaking. On the left, we have a patient. This patient is in a state of minimal consciousness, and you see that he's moving the eyes repeatedly, and it's really hard to understand what he wants to communicate. So the future generations will find a confusing world. They will interact more and more with machines that respond to any questions. They may even be anthropomorphized in a way. And then on the other side, we'll have patients with disconnected brains. So an important education is needed here. We need to develop measures, tools, instead of deciding to fall in love of a vocal assistant, as is the case in this movie, Her. So So what is the route we should go through? I've talked about theory, and with theory we have some initial inputs. This is the cerebellum, which is an extraordinary organ, a marvelous neural system that is in the nape area, and it has an amount of neurons that is incredible. 1/4 of neurons in the brain are in the cerebellum. There are 20 billion neurons are in the cortex, in the cerebral cortex. And the cerebellum allows us to do lots of things. If I'm talking to you right now without having to think about the words and the syntax, but just having a vague idea what I want to say, is thanks to the cerebellum. If I can drive down to Naples talking to my neighbors or to my traveling companions freely without having to think how to drive the car, accelerating, decelerating, is thanks to the cerebellum, most of that. And if when I ski, I can really negotiate the way I ski and see the panorama, that's thanks to the cerebellum. It's a predictive machine that has a lot of power, but it's also a problem. It is not conscious. We know that because in patients where the cerebellum is removed or where it doesn't develop, consciousness is there, as vivid as before. So we can take away 3/4 of neurons and consciousness is there. And why does this happen? Well, the little thing that we know from theory can help us explain this easily. If we look at cerebellum, cortex, and brain, there is a fundamental difference. Cerebral cortex, to begin with, has two hemispheres that are connected by billions of fibers. They are united by one single thing, and inside each hemisphere, we see that there is a balance. This is the pattern of connectivity inside the cerebral cortex. There is an incredible balance between different areas with different properties that are strictly connected as a whole. There is short connections. So cerebral connection is fully integrated in a differentiated system that is very rich and as a whole. If we look at the cerebellum and we split it into two, there is not callosum. There are two independent bodies, and if we look at this inside, we see that this is structured into a modular pattern, very small and not connected between each other. Basically, this is not a whole. It has a name. We can hold it in one hand, but it is not a whole, just like the brain. It is a collection of different elements where stimuli gets in and gets out quite fast. And this architecture is also a very efficient architecture, and it features AI systems right now. So for the moment, we can say that as long as artificial networks are made like this, modular feed forward, we should not be worried about the presence of consciousness, as long as they remain like this. So this can be a kind of guidelines for this issue. Now I am going to be provocative, as some scientists that studied the evolution of brain in different subjects, they claim that on the basis of volumetry, Neanderthal has a smaller cerebellum with respect to sapiens. So sapiens may have made it over the Neanderthal man because he was faster, more intelligent, and could make predictions and could be agile, but not because he was more conscious. This is a bit frightening because we are sapiens, and the evolution has already selected one's intelligence to the detriment of consciousness. Well, we are still conscious and we are interested in subjects, but this sort of mistake, so to say, as I said, I'm going I'm being provocative, but we should be careful with the future. We should not give too room to artificial intelligence systems that are similar to the cerebellum, that are fast and are more and more invasive. This is a metaphorical warning, if you like, but I think that this is important in my view. And then there is another issue that is more existential, that is the relation between consciousness and time, speed. To create these complex interactions and to put together all the cerebral areas, it takes time. It takes hundreds of milliseconds to have a full perception. However, we do things in a much faster way, 100, 200 milliseconds. For example, when we play tennis, conscious cannot really afford more than 3 operations per second consciously. We have these limits. However, when we play tennis, we catch the ball even when our player in front of us is good, and we don't do it consciously, because if you did it consciously, the ball would run out the pitch. And we can do it thanks to the cerebellum, thanks to this modular machine that is very fast. By the time the ball is hit by our contestant, we know on the basis of physical laws. It has a kind of deep learning method that help us predict where the ball will go. So in a modular way, this can be done. And with this is the speed, and the speed is there, but the cerebellum doesn't have a lot of consciousness, as we saw. So the problem is that outside humans, we are building machines that are similar to the cerebellum. This is the computer that I used when I was a young man. But many years have gone by, and the speed of microchips have been increasing exponentially. According to the prime law of Moore, now the machines we use today are faster and faster. For example, I don't know if this is now the fastest computer, a Chinese computer. A month ago it was. Now it can process an incredible number of operations per second. When I wrote my thesis in medicine, the internet had just started. If I clicked on a page and I had to wait 3 seconds, it was okay. Now we are very much influenced by speed. If now we don't get the page that we are surfing after 100 of milliseconds or 10 milliseconds, we get mad. But we don't have to get influenced by this, because consciousness takes time. We don't have to fall in this trap of the paradigm stimulus-answer, stimulus-response, because that would be detrimental to the time of consciousness. I think that this is important. Consciousness and its time should be emphasized, and should be also emphasized not just as a scientist, but as a man. And also pure consciousness should be emphasized. When we remain astounded in front of a sunset or in front of the sea, sometimes we have these sensations, and we have to learn to manage these machines that we create in a way that is compatible with our consciousness. And again, we should use the cerebellum as a reference. So with this machine, we can drive. It is good to use it, we rely on it, but in the meantime, we have a conversation with our traveling companion. We develop a good relationship with this extremely intelligent system, but which is not conscious, and then it helps us playing an instrument very well. At the beginning, we consciously play the keys of a piano in a very clumsy and slow way, but then our fingers would play by themselves, and their consciousness is free and can enjoy the symphony and the music. And we should be able to do the same with the machines that we create outside of us, without getting trapped by their speed, because consciousness takes time, and consciousness must be valued as such. Here we have some quotations that are examples of the fact that consciousness can exist by itself without any particular function. One can be without doing. The first is by a patient recovering from a syncope that has this experience of existence in general without distinguishing anything, without thoughts. So experience exists in this status. And this fact has been recognized for thousands of years, first by Oriental religions and then also in Western religions. And this is important and should be emphasized. And I think that this is something that should unite us in distinguishing between being and being conscient, having a consciousness. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcello, for all the information that you have shared with us. And thank you so much for being available in accompanying us in the work that we have done for the meeting in Rimini. In the D3 hall, there is a space, the self, language, and conscience. And you are all invited to visit it, and all the work about consciousness has been supervised by Marcello. This approach and this method is humble on the one side. It uses scientific tools for what it can, and starting with material that is available for scientific research with a phenomenological approach that is drawing in a way on a philosophical approach that is starting with the experience that we do, and starting from this you have created a theory, and through the scientific method you're now trying to falsify it in a way. I think that this approach is a serious approach, and I understand you when you said that you take consciousness really seriously, because it's a method that it takes time. There will be many steps to be made. I think we are at the beginning. There will be many discoveries that you will be able to share in the next few years, and I hope that you'll be able to be here in presence next time. Thanks again for your lecture. Thanks to you all, and have a nice evening. Before closing our session, I would like to remind you all that your contribution is important to build the meeting. You know that the meeting of Rimini is a unique event. It is totally free. And to support all the activities and all the proposals, it is fundamental to have support from donors. Donations have great value, and it is a simple gesture for responsibility to build this event. You can make your donation at the Dona Ora desks with the red heart. You'll find volunteers wearing a red T-shirt with the Dona Ora logo. And part of the donations collected this year will be used to support a welcoming house in Kampala, where Rose welcomes children from difficult background, and there is also an exhibition about the story of Rose and her women. Thanks again, and I wish you all the very best.
honest, I feel like getting right back to these comments. You motherfuckers keep the drama. I'm working on the world premiere, and I can see the world premiere. I know there must be something happening here. I know someday I'll meet you halfway there in that atmosphere. Cheers.
Ciao, sono Rossana. Ti volevo presentare mio nipote.
Piacere,
Ciao, piacere.
complimenti, hai molto bello. Un sacco.
Lui è
Sono laureato in fisica, sono laureato ad ottobre adesso. Cosa? Ho fatto fisica teorica io.